The envelope arrived at the War Department archives in February 1963, 45 years late, postmarked from a town that no longer appeared on any map. Inside, a military roll call dated November 11, 1918. Company G, 339th Infantry Regiment. 23 names, each marked present for morning formation. Standard documentation for the armistice. But Company G never assembled that morning. The regiment's official deployment records place the entire unit in northern Russia, frozen into defensive positions along the Dvina River, 7,000 miles from where this roll call claims they stood. War Department ledgers confirm it. No American troops remained at the stateside training facility after September 1918. The barracks had been emptied, converted for influenza quarantine. Yet here, preserved in regulation ink on standard army forms, 23 men answered to their names in a place that should have been silent. The handwriting belongs to Lieutenant Marcus Webb. His signature appears at the bottom, countersigned by a company clerk. Both men are documented as having frozen to death in Russia 3 weeks before this roll call was recorded. Before the record unfolds further, comment your city and the current hour. These events left traces survived only under certain conditions, and even the timing of your watching becomes part of the archive. The contradiction lives in the permanent record now. Filed between routine morning reports and supply requisitions, archived under unresolved administrative discrepancies 1918 to 1919. 43 similar documents were eventually recovered. Each one impossible, each one authenticated, because the absence spoke louder than any deployment order ever could. The War Department maintained strict photographic protocols in 1918. Every company portrait required documentation, date, location, personnel roster cross-referenced against morning formation. The photograph of Company G, taken at Camp Custer, Michigan, August 14, 1918, follows every regulation. 137 men arranged in 4 rows. The Michigan summer renders everything in harsh clarity. Faces sharp, uniforms crisp, shadows falling precisely where August sunlight would demand. The company roster lists 137 names. Each face can be matched to a service record. Except 3 faces appear twice. Private Thomas Hensley stands in the back row, 3rd from the left. His face, identical posture, identical expression, also occupies a position in the front row, 7 men distant. The photographic laboratory examined both instances under magnification. Same scar above the left eyebrow, same slightly offset ear, not brothers, not similar men, identical. Corporal James Rivera appears in 2 locations simultaneously. Private Anton Kozak occupies 3 positions in the same photograph. The negative shows no evidence of manipulation, no double exposure. No photographic trickery available in 1918 could produce this effect. The overlap occurs in continuous rows, with other men's shoulders overlapping the duplicate figures naturally, shadows falling consistently across all subjects. The photographer, Sergeant William Cross, logged the session in his duty journal. Single exposure, no complications. Standard procedure. He noted nothing unusual. His journal entry ends mid-sentence, 3 weeks later. The remaining pages were removed with a blade. Dr. Caroline Mayhew served as civilian medical examiner for Muskegon County, Michigan from 1912 through 1931. Her records document every death with methodical precision: cause, time, witnesses, disposition of remains. 19 years of township deaths, factory accidents, influenza casualties, all cataloged without hesitation, until November 1918. Between November 9th and November 15th, 7 bodies arrived at her examination facility, all military personnel from Camp Custer. All officially listed as training casualties. Accidents, equipment failures, routine wartime deaths that required civilian certification before military burial. Dr. Mayhew examined none of them. Her ledger records their arrival. Names, ranks, stated causes of death, transcribed from military paperwork. But the examination fields remain blank. No autopsy notes, no physical descriptions, no signatures. Instead, a single notation repeated across all 7 entries. Certification declined. Remains released to military authority without examination. In 19 years of service, Dr. Mayhew never refused an examination. County regulations required civilian verification for all deaths occurring in her jurisdiction. The military had no authority to overrule her. She violated protocol 7 times in 7 days. Her personal correspondence from that month survives. Letters to her sister in Chicago, routine discussion of weather, county politics, minor cases. November 12th, she mentions accepting delivery of materials that should not exist in the condition presented. November 14th, I have been asked to certify what I cannot explain. The letter dated November 16th was never sent. Found sealed in her desk after her death in 1931, still addressed but unstamped. Inside, the dead don't arrive twice. Military logistics in 1918 operated on redundant documentation. Every supply shipment required 3 copies: origin manifest, transport verification, destination receipt. The system existed specifically to prevent loss, theft, or administrative confusion during wartime chaos. Camp Custer received 17 supply shipments during November 1918. 16 follow standard procedure. Manifests align perfectly, signatures match, contents verified. The 17th shipment arrived November 13th, documented as medical supplies and equipment, standard issue. The destination receipt exists. Camp Custer personnel signed for 12 crates, confirmed delivery, noted storage location in the quartermaster's log. But no origin manifest exists. No transport verification. No record of the shipment leaving any supply depot, medical facility, or manufacturing center. The U.S. Army maintained meticulous supply chain documentation across 47 warehouses, 16 medical depots, and hundreds of contractor facilities. This shipment appears in the record only upon arrival, as if it materialized fully formed at the camp gates. The quartermaster's log notes the contents: standard medical supplies per regulation specifications. But Corporal Dennis Morton, who helped unload the crates, recorded different observations in his personal diary. Equipment unfamiliar to standard field issue. Instruments marked with manufacturer codes not found in Army catalogs. Dr. Brennan examined contents privately, ordered immediate secure storage. Captain William Brennan served as camp medical officer. His official reports from November mention nothing unusual. His personal effects, recovered after his death in 1927, included a leather journal containing a single entry dated November 13, 1918. The instruments suggest preparation for conditions that haven't occurred yet. The 12 crates were transferred to secure storage. The transfer documentation lists their destination as Medical Archive Facility 7, DEP designation classified. No facility with that designation existed in 1918. Military training in 1918 carried inherent dangers. Live ammunition exercises, trench warfare simulations, gas mask drills, all produced casualties accepted as the cost of combat readiness. Camp Custer documented every training death with standard incident reports: time, location, witnesses, immediate cause. Private Daniel Foster died November 10, 1918, during a grenade training exercise. The incident report specifies EO843 hours, Training Field C, Section 4. Witness statements from 3 officers and 7 enlisted men describe the accident identically. Improper grenade handling, premature detonation, fatal shrapnel wounds. Dr. Brennan's certified death at 0920 hours. The burial detail interred Private Foster at Camp Custer Cemetery, Section 3, Plot 47, November 11, 1918. On November 14th, Private Daniel Foster died again. The second incident report documents identical circumstances. 0843 hours, Training Field C, Section 4, grenade training accident, identical witness statements, death certified by Dr. Brennan at 0920 hours. 7 of the 9 witnesses from the first incident appear again, providing sworn statements matching their previous testimony, nearly word for word. The second burial occurred November 15th, Camp Custer Cemetery, Section 3, Plot 52. Both graves exist. Both contain remains identified as Private Daniel Foster through standard identification procedures, dog tags, physical description, personal effects. Both sets of remains were returned to Foster's family in Ohio in 1919, shipped in separate caskets 3 weeks apart. Foster's mother, Rebecca, accepted the first burial with expected grief. When military personnel arrived with the second casket, she reportedly stood on her porch without speaking for 17 minutes before allowing them to proceed. Her letter to the War Department, dated December 1918, asks only, "Which son did I raise?" The War Department's response, if any existed, has been removed from her correspondence file. Only the mounting bracket remains where the document was attached. Morning formations at Camp Custer followed rigid military protocol. Companies assembled at 0600 hours daily. Roll call proceeded alphabetically. Absences were immediately documented. The procedure existed to maintain unit cohesion, track personnel, identify problems before they escalated. Between November 9th and November 17th, 1918, Company G conducted formation normally. The roll call records show standard attendance, minor variations for sick call, duty assignments, expected deviations. No mass absences, no irregularities noted by commanding officers. Yet Lieutenant Webb's personal correspondence during this period described something different. His letter to his wife, dated November 12th. The formations grow quieter each day. The men stand correctly, answer when called, maintain discipline. But something in their responses feels automatic now, as though they speak from great distances. Morrison stood beside me this morning, and I could not remember his face, though I've served with him for 8 months. November 14th, I called the morning roll today and heard my own voice answer for men who weren't present. Or perhaps they were present. The rows seem fuller than the numbers account for. The official morning reports record no such observations. Lieutenant Webb signed each report, certifying accurate attendance, proper formation, no irregularities. By November 16th, his letters stopped mentioning formations entirely. Instead, we stand where we're told to stand. We answer when names are called. Whether we're the ones answering remains unclear. The final letter, dated November 18th, arrived at his wife's address in Pennsylvania, postmarked November 11th, the day before he reportedly wrote it. She noted the discrepancy in her own correspondence, questioned whether her husband had misdated the letter in confusion. But the postmark is official, authenticated, processed through military postal channels with standard procedure. The letter traveled backward through time, or was written by someone who hadn't experienced the days it described yet. Military records maintained daily logs. Every action, movement, incident documented to establish clear chronological accountability. Camp Custer's administrative office produced these logs without interruption from the facility's opening in 1917 through its closure in 1919. Except November 13th, 1918, produces no documentation. The log dated November 12th ends normally. Routine activities, evening formations, guard rotations established for overnight duty. November 14th begins normally. Morning activities, personnel assignments, standard operations. November 13th simply doesn't exist in the administrative record. No daily log, no incident reports, no morning formation records, no supply requisitions, no medical calls, no guard duty rosters, no communications logs, no visiting officer reports, no kitchen inventory, no ammunition expenditure tracking. The entire infrastructure of military documentation, dozens of separate record-keeping systems maintained by different departments, produces nothing for those 24 hours. Camp Custer did not cease operations. Personal letters from soldiers dated November 13th describe normal activities, training exercises, meals, routine duties. Corporal Morton's diary includes an entry for that date, discussing a baseball game between companies. The institution simply stopped recording itself. Weather records from the National Weather Service document conditions at nearby Muskegon on November 13th. Clear skies, temperature 34 degrees, wind from the northwest. The weather existed. The date existed. But the military's obsessive documentation apparatus went silent, as if someone removed the day from official existence while leaving it intact in personal memory. The gap suggests not absence, but deliberate omission. Not a missing day, but a day someone chose not to archive. Or a day that couldn't be explained using the language available to military documentation in 1918. The 339th Infantry Regiment received deployment orders September 4, 1918. Immediate transport to Archangel, Russia for Allied intervention operations. The orders specified complete regimental deployment. All companies, all personnel, no exceptions. Standard wartime mobilization procedure. Company G departed Camp Custer September 12, 1918. Train transport to Camp Mills, New York, then Atlantic crossing to England. Final transport to Archangel. The journey took 37 days. By October 19th, the entire regiment was engaged in combat operations along the Dvina River. War Department records confirm the deployment. Shipping manifests, transport logs, combat reports, casualty notifications, every document places Company G in Russia from October 1918 forward. Yet a second set of deployment orders exists, dated November 10, 1918. Same regiment, same company. Orders directing Company G to deploy immediately to Archangel for the same mission the unit was already executing. The duplicate orders carry proper authorization signatures, routing numbers, distribution codes. They pass through standard military channels, were logged by multiple administrative offices, arrived at Camp Custer through official courier service. The orders direct personnel who had been in combat for 3 weeks to deploy to a location they already occupied. Captain Harold Morrison, Company G's commanding officer in Russia, noted the confusion in his field diary. Received notification from headquarters that replacement orders have been issued for our position. Strange, as we've held this sector since October. No mention of our existing deployment. Communications may be disrupted by weather. The War Department issued orders without apparent knowledge that the unit was already deployed. The administrative system lost track of an entire infantry company for 6 weeks, then attempted to send them to the location they already occupied. Or, the administrative system knew exactly where Company G was positioned and tried to send them there anyway. Both possibilities require the same conclusion. Something happened that military record-keeping couldn't properly document. The Signal Corps maintained photographic documentation of all military installations in 1918. Standard procedure: weekly photographs of facilities, training operations, personnel formations. Camp Custer received regular documentation from September through December 1918. The photographs, from November 10th through November 16th, required 11 attempts to develop. The first 6 attempts produced blank negatives despite proper exposure settings and documented lighting conditions. The Signal Corps photographer, Sergeant Arthur Reynolds, noted in his technical log, "Standard development procedure fails. Negatives show no image despite confirmed exposure. Film stock tested with control images functions normally. Attempts 7 through 9 produced partial images. Buildings visible, landscape elements clear, but all human figures appeared as dark voids, as if the men absorbed light rather than reflected it. Training Field C appeared in perfect focus. The 40 soldiers conducting exercises appeared as man-shaped absences, silhouettes of deeper black against the photographic grain. Attempt 10 produced a complete image. Every element visible, properly exposed, technically sound. Sergeant Reynolds filed the photographs with standard documentation, noted no irregularities in his log. But the developed photographs show activities that weren't scheduled for those dates. November 12th photographs document a regimental parade, full ceremonial formations, dress uniforms, band instruments. No parade was scheduled. No orders authorized ceremonial formations. Personnel interviewed later had no memory of participating in any parade that week. November 15th photographs show training equipment that doesn't appear in any other documentation. Structures not listed in facility inventories. Weapons configurations not matching standard issue. Field layouts inconsistent with established training protocols. Sergeant Reynolds' final log entry, November 17th. The images develop, but they document events that didn't occur or occurred differently than participants remember. Photography is meant to fix truth. These images fix something else. The 11th attempt was never completed. The undeveloped negatives remain in storage, marked technical failure, development abandoned. No explanation given for why they were preserved rather than discarded. Military mail in 1918 traveled slowly but predictably. Soldiers mailed letters from camp, postal channels processed them through routing stations, delivery occurred 3 to 7 days later. The system operated with mechanical consistency despite wartime conditions. 23 letters from Company G personnel, mailed between November 14th and November 18th, 1918, arrived at their destinations November 8th through November 10th. The letters arrived 4 to 8 days before they were written. Postmarks authenticate the dates. Official military postal stamps, dated and processed through standard channels. But the letters' contents reference events that hadn't occurred yet when they were delivered. Private Morrison's letter to his brother, delivered November 9th, describes a training accident that occurred November 14th. Details matching the incident report exactly, including names of witnesses and specific injuries. Corporal Hayes's letter to his mother, delivered November 8th, mentions the photograph we took today that showed us standing in wrong places. The photograph referenced, the image of duplicate faces, was taken November 13th. Lieutenant Webb's letter to his wife, delivered November 10th, states, "Tomorrow I will write the roll call for men who aren't here. I haven't done this yet, but I remember doing it clearly." Recipients initially dismissed the discrepancies as date confusion, soldiers becoming disoriented under training pressure. But when the events described in the early arriving letters occurred exactly as detailed, families began preserving the correspondence, noting the temporal impossibilities. The Military Postal Service investigated. Postmasters examined processing records, traced routing through distribution centers, verified stamp authentications. The investigation concluded. Letters processed through standard channels on dates indicated by postmarks. No evidence of procedural irregularities. No explanation for temporal discrepancy. The investigation file contains one additional document, an unsigned memorandum suggesting the postmarks were somehow applied before the letters were written, or the letters were written in response to memories of their own future delivery. Both explanations assume correspondence can exist outside causal sequence. Both explanations appear equally probable based on available evidence. Dr. Brennan maintained meticulous medical records. Every sick call, injury treatment, and physical examination documented with clinical precision. His files for Company G personnel contain 847 individual entries between September and December 1918, covering routine ailments, training injuries, and influenza cases. But 43 records contain internal contradictions that should be impossible. Private Vincent Calabrese's file documents treatment for a fractured left radius on November 11th. X-ray notation, splint application, expected healing timeline. The same file dated November 8th describes removing the splint and certifying complete healing. The healing precedes the injury by 3 days. Corporal Jensen's medical record charts influenza symptoms, developing November 10th through November 14th, fever progression, respiratory decline, recovery. But the file also contains an examination dated November 9th, noting full recovery from influenza infection, return to duty, with symptoms that match the infection he wouldn't develop until the following day. Dr. Brennan's clinical notes demonstrate his awareness of these impossibilities. Marginal annotations in his handwriting. Patient presents with injury not yet sustained. Treatment provided for condition that will manifest tomorrow. Recovery documented before illness onset. The annotations suggest not confusion, but documentation of an observed phenomenon. Dr. Brennan wasn't making mistakes. He was recording what he witnessed, even when the observations defied medical causality. His personal journal, recovered from his effects in 1927, contains an entry dated November 15, 1918. "I am treating men for tomorrow's injuries today. The medical timeline has inverted. Cause and effect operate independently now, or perhaps they've always operated this way, and our instruments simply weren't calibrated to measure it. I cannot determine whether I'm healing them before they're wounded, or healing them has caused the wounds." The final entry in his medical log, November 17th, reads only, "All treatments completed. All injuries sustained, sequence uncertain." The records remain filed in standard chronological order, as if the temporal inversions they document were unremarkable administrative details. Sergeant Paul Henderson served as Company G's administrative clerk from August through December 1918. His duties included maintaining personnel records, processing paperwork, documenting daily activities. His position required him to be present for every formation, every roll call, every significant company event. His testimony, recorded during the Army's internal review in January 1919, describes November 1918 with unusual precision. Morning formations proceeded normally. Roll calls completed without incident. Training exercises followed established schedules. All personnel accounted for. No irregularities observed. But his testimony contradicts every other record. He states Captain Morrison commanded Company G during November. Captain Morrison was in Russia. He describes training exercises on dates the administrative log shows no activities occurred. He lists personnel as present who were documented in the medical facility or on leave. The review board questioned these discrepancies. Henderson's responses remained consistent. I observed what I reported. I was present for all company activities. My observations are accurate. When presented with conflicting documentation, photographs showing activities he claims didn't occur, medical records indicating personnel were unavailable when he reported them present, Henderson examined each piece of evidence carefully, then repeated, I saw nothing inconsistent with standard operations. The board examined his mental fitness. 3 doctors certified him psychologically sound, mentally competent, showing no signs of confusion or deception. Henderson wasn't lying. He wasn't confused. He simply described a version of November 1918 that existed nowhere in any other record. His personnel file contains a notation from the reviewing officer. Witness demonstrates complete certainty regarding observations that conflict with all documentation. Unable to determine whether witness experienced different events or same events differently. Recommend no disciplinary action. Phenomenon not attributable to witness failure. Henderson's final statement to the board, I kept accurate records of what occurred. That my records differ from others suggests we observed different occurrences, not that I observed incorrectly. Perhaps the question isn't why my testimony conflicts with evidence, but why we assume evidence and testimony should align. The board closed the review without conclusions. Henderson continued clerical duties through 1919, maintaining records with the same precision, never acknowledging that his documentation described a reality no one else observed. Military supply chains in 1918 operated through documented requisition procedures. Every item issued to personnel required paperwork, requisition forms, authorization signatures, inventory adjustments, receipt confirmations. Camp Custer maintained these records with standard military precision. But Company G personnel possessed equipment that appears in no supply documentation. The inventory discrepancy appeared during a routine audit, February 1919. Captain James Walsh, conducting standard post-war equipment reconciliation, documented items in Company G's possession that matched no existing requisition records. Specialized training equipment, modified weapons configurations, medical instruments not included in standard military inventory. The equipment physically existed. Walsh examined each item, verified serial numbers, photographed examples. But the paper trail establishing how the equipment arrived at camp, the fundamental requirement of military supply procedures, simply didn't exist. Walsh's audit report lists 47 specific items present without documentation. The report includes detailed descriptions, specialized breathing apparatus, configuration unknown, no manufacturer markings matching military contracts, portable medical diagnostic equipment incorporating technology not present in standard field issue, training weapons modified with safety mechanisms not approved by ordnance standards. The report asks how this equipment arrived, who authorized its issue, why no documentation exists. Walsh followed standard investigation procedures, interviewed supply personnel, examined warehouse records, traced potential requisition pathways. Every investigation avenue terminated without explanation. No supply sergeant remembered issuing the equipment. No warehouse showed it in stock. No requisition forms existed. No authorization signatures. No shipping manifests. The equipment appeared as if it had always been present, integrated into Company G's operations without anyone noticing its arrival. Walsh's final notation: equipment exists, documentation does not, unable to establish chain of custody. Recommend removal from inventory and secure storage pending explanation of origin. The equipment was transferred to Medical Archive Facility 7, the same location that received the mysterious shipment from November. The transfer documentation lists the destination. But when investigators attempted to locate this facility in 1947 during a broader military records consolidation project, no such installation could be found. The equipment and the facility meant to contain it vanished from administrative existence while remaining documented in transfer records. Lieutenant Webb died in Russia December 2, 1918. The casualty report documents his death during a defensive action along the Dvina River. Rifle fire, immediate fatality, burial in field cemetery. Captain Morrison filed the report. 7 witnesses provided statements. The death certificate arrived at the War Department January 1919. On December 15, 1918, Lieutenant Webb's signature appeared on Company G's morning roll call roster at Camp Custer. The roster is authentic. The signature matches Webb's handwriting, verified through comparison with previous documentation. The document passed through standard administrative channels, was filed with routine morning reports, showed no evidence of forgery or alteration. The roster documents of formation Lieutenant Webb could not have attended, signed with a signature he could not have produced, processed through an administrative system that recorded his death 2 weeks earlier. But this roster wasn't the first posthumous documentation. Detailed examination of Company G's records revealed Lieutenant Webb's signature on 12 different documents dated after his death. Roll calls through December 20th, supply requisitions, duty rosters, personnel evaluations. Each signature authentic, each document processed normally through military channels. The administrative system continued receiving documentation from an officer it had already declared deceased. No one noticed. The paperwork flowed through standard procedures, was filed in appropriate locations, became part of the permanent record. Captain Morrison, informed of the posthumous signatures during the 1919 review, stated, "Lieutenant Webb handled administrative duties conscientiously. I'm unsure whether his death interrupted that conscientiousness, or whether administrative duties continue independent of the personnel performing them." The review board examined one additional piece of evidence. A letter from Lieutenant Webb to his wife, delivered to her Pennsylvania address December 18, 1918. The letter discusses his death with strange detachment. "I am told I died in Russia December 2nd. This may be accurate, but I continue performing my duties, which suggests either I didn't die or death doesn't prevent completion of administrative obligations. I remain uncertain which possibility troubles me more." The letter arrived bearing Lieutenant Webb's authentic signature, written in his handwriting, postmarked through military channels. His wife received notifications of his death, his burial, and his continued correspondence simultaneously. She filed all 3 sets of documents together, marked unreconciled. Private Anton Kozak provided testimony during the initial investigation, January 1919. His statement described November 1918 at Camp Custer. Training activities, daily routines, interactions with company personnel. The testimony was recorded by a military stenographer, signed by Kozak, witnessed by investigating officers. The same testimony, re-examined during a follow-up review in March 1919, contained different content. The document remained the same paper, same signatures, same date stamp, but the words had changed. Sentences that originally described routine training exercises now referenced events that never appeared in the first version. Names of personnel mentioned in March hadn't been present in January. Descriptions of incidents recorded in March bore no relation to the content transcribed 70 days earlier. The stenographer, Corporal Sarah Mitchell, was questioned about the discrepancy. She produced her original stenographic notes from January. The notes matched the March version, not the January version everyone remembered. 3 officers who witnessed the original testimony and signed the document confirmed their memory. Kozak's statement in January described routine activities, but their signatures now authenticated a document containing testimony they didn't remember hearing. The investigation examined the physical document. No evidence of alteration, no signs of substitution, no indication the paper had been tampered with. The document simply contained different information than it had contained before, or had always contained that information, and observers' memories of the original content were false. Private Kozak, questioned about the discrepancy, stated, "I testified honestly both times, if there were 2 times. Perhaps the question isn't whether my testimony changed, but whether the events I testified about changed, requiring my testimony to align with current truth rather than previous truth." The investigation board certified the document as authentic, acknowledged the testimony had changed, could not explain how testimony preserved in physical records could alter retroactively. The final board notation. Document content appears mutable despite physical preservation. Suggests either records adjust to accommodate changing truth, or truth adjusts to accommodate recorded contradictions. Unable to determine which process operated. The case file contains both versions of Kozak's testimony, filed consecutively. Neither document indicates which version is current, or whether both versions remain simultaneously valid. The Camp Custer Administrative Archive, transferred to federal storage in 1922, comprised 47 volumes of daily logs, incident reports, and operational records. Standard military documentation covering 3 years of facility operation. The archive was complete, intact, properly indexed. In 1934, during routine archival maintenance, staff discovered 247 pages missing from various volumes. The pages had been removed cleanly, cut with precision from bound records, but the removal left no visible gaps. The books remained the same thickness. The pagination continued without interruption. Documents that should have been separated by missing pages sat adjacent to each other, as if the removed content had never existed. Archivists documented the phenomenon meticulously. Volume 7, covering November 1918, showed 15 pages removed. Yet the volume contained 312 pages, exactly the number documented in the 1922 transfer inventory. The removed pages hadn't reduced the book's physical presence. More disturbing, the content surrounding the removed pages now connected seamlessly, despite obvious logical gaps. November 12th's entry ended mid-sentence discussing morning formation. The next page began mid-sentence describing an evening inspection. The missing content, presumably covering 6 hours of daily operations, left no narrative void. The text read as continuous, as if events that should have required the missing pages to document had somehow compressed into no temporal space at all. Archivists attempted to locate the removed pages. They searched storage facilities, checked transfer records, interviewed every staff member with access. The pages weren't filed elsewhere. They hadn't been misfiled or lost. They simply no longer existed in any location. But spectroscopic analysis of the books revealed something unexpected. Faint impressions remained on pages adjacent to the removals. Pressure from writing on the missing pages had left impressions in the paper beneath. The impressions could be enhanced and read. The content recovered from these impressions didn't match standard military documentation. Instead, observations that defied procedural language. Formation dissolved before completion. Men observed standing in positions they'd already vacated. Equipment issued that personnel reported receiving previous week, though no prior distribution documented. Training exercise concluded before commencement. The impressions documented events that couldn't be processed through standard military record-keeping. Observations that violated the administrative language available to describe them. Someone had removed the pages that couldn't exist within military documentation framework, excising not the evidence of anomalies, but the attempts to record anomalies using vocabularies designed to document only normal operations. The removed pages didn't hide what happened. They removed the failed attempts to describe what happened using language incapable of containing the description. Military personnel records in 1918 required extensive documentation. Enlistment papers, physical examinations, training certifications, family notifications. No soldier entered service without generating substantial paperwork. The system existed specifically to maintain positive identification of all personnel. Company G's roster listed 142 men. Standard military documentation exists for 119 of them. 23 names appear on Company G rolls with no supporting records. No enlistment documentation. No physical examination reports. No home addresses for family notification. No prior service records. No transfer orders indicating their arrival at Camp Custer. The names simply appeared on rosters beginning November 9, 1918, as if these men had always been present. The War Department investigation attempted to trace these 23 personnel through standard identification procedures. They checked enlistment centers nationwide, contacted local draft boards, examined birth records, searched city directories. No matches. 23 men serving in a military unit left no documentary trace of their existence outside that unit's rosters. Private William Garrett appeared on Company G rolls November 9th. His name continues through subsequent roll calls until November 17th. But no William Garrett enlisted in U.S. military service in 1917-1918. No draft registration exists. No birth certificate matches the minimal biographical information recorded. The name existed only within Company G's documentation. All 23 undocumented names followed similar patterns, appeared suddenly on rosters, participated in formations and activities according to daily logs, then either disappeared from records or appeared on casualty lists with no next of kin information. The investigation interviewed soldiers who served alongside these undocumented personnel. The responses showed unsettling consistency. Garrett? Yeah, I served with him. Don't remember his face clearly. Don't recall conversations, but he was there. I remember his presence. Morrison assigned me to a detail with 3 other men. I remember 4 of us working. Can only recall 2 names clearly. The others were, I know they were present. Can't visualize them now. The documented men remembered the undocumented men as absences shaped like presents. Shadows where soldiers should have stood. Names that filled roster positions without attaching to specific human beings. One soldier's testimony captured the phenomenon precisely. The unit felt properly staffed. We had enough men for assigned duties. But if you tried to count us, some men you counted didn't quite complete. Like looking at them required more attention than they possessed. They were there by being not absent, rather than by being present. The 23 undocumented names constituted not men without records, but records without men. Administrative placeholders that maintained proper roster numbers while documenting personnel who existed only as documentation. Camp Custer's infrastructure developed in documented stages through 1917-1918. Construction records detail every building: barracks, training facilities, administrative offices, medical buildings. Each structure has blueprints, construction contracts, inspection reports, completion certifications. Building 7J appears in operational records throughout November 1918, but exists in no construction documentation. The building is referenced repeatedly, equipment stored in Building 7J, personnel reported to Building 7J for medical examination, quartermaster requisitions processed through Building 7J supply office. Daily operational logs place activities in this structure consistently, but no blueprints exist, no construction contract, no building permit, no inspection reports. The facility appears in camp maps used during November, then disappears from later maps without any demolition records. Aerial photographs of Camp Custer, taken by Army Air Service in October 1918 and January 1919, show the location where Building 7J should have stood. The October image shows an empty lot. The January image shows the same empty lot. No building appears in either photograph. Yet ground-level photographs from November show personnel entering and exiting a structure at that precise location. A standard military building, wood frame construction, typical camp architecture. The building existed at ground level but vanished from aerial perspective. Private Daniel Morton's diary describes entering Building 7J. November 14th. Reported for medical examination. Building standard military construction, but interior layout felt wrong. Hallways longer than exterior dimensions should allow, rooms connecting in configurations that didn't match the structure's outside shape. Like the building was larger inside than outside permitted. Corporal Hayes's letter mentions similar observations. The new medical facility feels displaced somehow. You enter it, move through it normally, but exiting returns you to the camp at a slightly different angle than you entered, as though the building rotates your position without rotating itself. Post-war construction surveys documented all Camp Custer buildings for demolition or transfer purposes. The survey team noted structural anomaly at grid position corresponding to Building 7J references in operational logs. No building present. Foundation shows no evidence of recent construction or demolition. Earth appears undisturbed for minimum 5 years. Unable to reconcile documentary evidence of building with physical absence of any structure. The survey chief's report included a personal observation. We've documented what isn't there. The absence has specific dimensions, specific locations in daily logs, specific functions. This suggests we're measuring not a missing building, but a building that exists as documentation only, architecture made of paper rather than wood, foundations laid in filing systems rather than earth. Building 7J wasn't demolished and erased from records. It existed solely as references, as coordination points in administrative documents, as a shared understanding among personnel who reported to it despite its physical absence. Private James Chen died 4 times at Camp Custer between November 10th and November 17th, 1918. Each death was documented through standard military procedures, witness statements, medical certification, casualty reports, burial details. Each death occurred differently, in different locations, with different causes. November 10th, training accident, blunt force trauma, certified dead at scene by Dr. Brennan. Witnesses, 6 soldiers, 2 officers. Burial, November 11th, Camp Custer Cemetery. November 13th, influenza complications, died in medical facility, Euro 340 hours. Death certificate signed Dr. Brennan. Witnesses, medical staff, 2 patients in adjacent beds. Burial, November 14th. November 15th, accidental discharge during weapons training, fatal gunshot wound, death instantaneous. Witnesses, training instructor, 12 company members. Burial, November 16th. November 17th, found deceased in barracks, cause undetermined, estimated time of death, 0200 hours. Witnesses, barracks mates, duty officer. Burial, November 18th. 4 death certificates. 4 separate burial plots in Camp Custer Cemetery, each containing remains identified as Private James Chen through dog tags and physical description. 4 sets of casualty notifications sent to his family in California. The investigation board attempted to resolve the impossibility through identity confusion. Perhaps 4 different men named James Chen died. But Army records showed only one James Chen enlisted from California in 1918. Only one service number matching the death certificates. Only one set of enlistment records. Witnesses from each death were interviewed. They maintained their testimony. They witnessed James Chen die. When informed of previous deaths, witnesses showed confusion but affirmed their observations. I saw Chen die in the training accident November 10th. I helped carry his body. He was dead. Presented with the November 13th death certificate, same witness. That can't be accurate. Chen was already dead. I buried him November 11th. Dr. Brennan's medical records contain all 4 death certifications, each signed with his authentic signature, each documenting different fatal injuries. His personal journal addresses the impossibility directly. Chen has died 4 times under my care. Each death legitimate, properly documented, medically certain. I cannot explain how a man dies repeatedly except to note that repetition implies time operates differently for him than for the documentation of him. Perhaps his death occurs once, but reverberates through multiple temporal coordinates, manifesting as separate deaths in our linear observation. Private Chen's family in California received 4 separate casualty notifications, 4 telegrams expressing military sympathy, 4 burial plot assignments. His mother's letter to the War Department, December 1918. I understand my son died in service. I don't understand how he died 4 times or which death I should grieve. Please inform me which burial contains my child, or if all burials contain him simultaneously. The War Department's response suggested administrative error, promised investigation, offered condolences. But the 4 graves remain, 4 sets of remains documented as James Chen, 4 deaths certified by military medical authority. The cemetery records list all 4 plots under his name, marked status, confirmed, multiple. The official investigation report, compiled March 1919 by Major General Thomas Richardson, summarized the Camp Custer anomalies in 47 pages of testimony, evidence examination, and findings. The report was typed, signed, witnessed, filed in War Department archives. Between 1919 and 1947, the report's conclusions changed 3 times. The 1919 version concluded, documented irregularities result from administrative confusion during wartime conditions. No evidence of systemic anomalies. Recommend improved record-keeping procedures. When researchers examined the report in 1934 for a General Army Records review, it contained different conclusions. Documented irregularities cannot be explained through administrative error. Evidence suggests temporal disruption affecting Company G operations, November 1918. Phenomenon beyond current investigative capability. recommend continued observation and documentation. The 1947 examination, conducted during post-war records consolidation, found a third version. Documented irregularities demonstrate systematic breakdown of causal sequence. Events documented in Camp Custer, November 1918, show evidence of temporal nonlinearity. Recommend classification and restricted access pending development of appropriate analytical framework. The physical document remained unchanged. Same paper, same signatures, same file and classification. But the content transformed to reflect increasingly explicit acknowledgement of the temporal impossibilities the investigation encountered. Researchers compared archived photocopies of the report made during different examinations. Even the photocopies showed altered text despite being preserved separately from the original document. The conclusion section updated retroactively across all copies, as if the document's content adjusted to accommodate current understanding rather than preserving historical conclusions. Major General Richardson died in 1932. His personal papers, donated to military archives, contained a sealed letter addressed to future investigators of the Camp Custer phenomenon. The letter, opened during the 1947 review, stated, "I filed my official conclusions March 1919 with awareness they were inadequate. The evidence I examined demanded conclusions I couldn't officially record: temporal inversions, causal violations, documentation of events that couldn't exist within our understanding of sequential time. I filed conservative conclusions knowing the evidence would eventually force acknowledgement." If you're reading this, my report has probably rewritten itself to reflect what I couldn't initially state. This isn't evidence of altered documents, but evidence that some truths can only be documented after observers develop capacity to recognize them. The report always contained these conclusions. We simply weren't capable of reading them yet. The investigation board's final meeting, documented in previously classified minutes, released 1963, discussed whether to preserve the original 1919 conclusions or accept the evolved versions. The board concluded, "The report documents truth. That truth appears different to observers at different times, suggests either truth evolves or observers' capacity to recognize truth evolves. Unable to determine which, recommend accepting the report as currently written while acknowledging it may continue updating." The report remains in archives, classified status dynamic. The archive photographs from Camp Custer, hundreds of images documenting facilities, personnel, training operations, remain stable in storage from 1922 through 1951. Standard photographic preservation, controlled environment, no deterioration noted. In 1952, archivists noticed the photographs contained different content than original cataloging descriptions indicated. November 12th photograph, originally cataloged as Company G Morning Formation, 142 personnel, standard arrangement, showed 139 personnel. 3 soldiers documented in the original catalog no longer appeared in the image. Their positions in formation remained, gaps where men should have stood, but the men themselves had vanished from the photograph. The phenomenon expanded. By 1955, multiple photographs showed altered content. Buildings appearing in different positions, personnel absent from images where they'd been documented, training equipment changing configurations between examinations. Most disturbing, some photographs showed movement. The November 15th photograph of training field activities, examined in 1957, showed soldiers in different positions than they'd occupied in previous examinations. The figures had moved within the photograph, not substantially but measurably, an arm raised that had been lowered. A head turned toward the camera that previously faced away. Positions shifted by inches, postures altered by degrees. The photographs weren't static records, they were continuing documentation of events that hadn't finished occurring. Archival staff conducted controlled observations. They photographed the photographs, establishing baseline positions. 6 months later, comparison showed changes. Figures moved, shadows shifted, architectural elements appeared or vanished. The photographs were documenting events that continued unfolding in 1918, despite being preserved in 1957. Time hadn't stopped when the shutter closed. The images captured ongoing processes that transcended photographic fixation. One image became particularly significant, the Company G formation photograph from November 11, 1918. Originally showing 137 personnel, the photograph gradually lost figures. By 1960, only 119 soldiers remained visible. By 1963, 97. The men were disappearing from the photograph at a rate of approximately 3 to 4 figures per year. Archival projections suggested the photograph would be completely empty by 1971. The archival report noted, photographic records designed to preserve past events instead document ongoing dissolution. Images don't capture moments, but participate in them. The photographs aren't becoming empty. The 1918 formation is becoming empty, and the photographs accurately reflect that emptying. This suggests either the past continues occurring despite our assumption it's concluded, or photographic documentation exists outside temporal linearity, showing us past events from future perspectives. The archive ceased public access to the Camp Custer photographs in 1963. The images continue undergoing observation by specialized archival staff who document the changes but cannot explain or prevent them. The last examination, 1985, showed only 37 figures remaining in the November 11th formation photograph. Archivist notation: the men are still disappearing. We're documenting their gradual absence from an event that occurred 67 years ago. Unable to determine if they're leaving the photograph or if the photograph is finally showing where they actually were all along. The 1963 investigation included interviews with surviving Company G personnel, 23 men still living 45 years after the events. The interviews were conducted individually, recorded, transcribed, filed as classified testimony. None of the survivors spoke about November 1918. The investigators asked direct questions. What occurred during training that month? Did you observe irregularities? Do you remember the temporal anomalies documented in official records? The survivors responded with detailed memories of every other period: deployment to Russia, combat operations, return home, post-war adjustment. They described August 1918, October 1918, December 1918 with vivid specificity. November produced silence. Not evasion, not claims of forgotten details. Silence, long pauses where responses should have been, staring at walls, hands folding and unfolding, then redirecting to other topics. The men couldn't speak about November. Corporal Hayes interviewed June 1963. I remember September training clearly. Deployment October 19th. I remember Russia, every frozen day. December, returning stateside, medical treatment. November. I'm sure November occurred. I must have been there. Can't recall it. Like trying to remember dreams while awake. You know you dreamed, but accessing the content requires being asleep again. November is when something happened. That's the most accurate statement I can make. Something happened occupying the space where November should be, but recalling it would require experiencing it again, and I don't believe I want to experience it again. Lieutenant Morrison provided the most extensive non-response. You're asking what I observed November 1918 at Camp Custer. That's the issue. I don't know if I was at Camp Custer in November. Records say Company G was in Russia. My memories agree, but other records show morning formations at camp. Both versions feel true. I can't speak about November because I can't locate where November happened for me. It might have happened in 2 places simultaneously, or neither place completely. Speaking about it would require choosing which version I experienced, and choosing would make one version false. I prefer leaving both versions possible. The investigation board noted a pattern. Survivors didn't deny the events. They confirmed the documentation existed. They acknowledged their presence at Camp Custer. But they couldn't transform acknowledgement into testimony. The events remained experientially inaccessible despite being documentarily established. The final interview summary stated, "Witnesses possess memories but cannot articulate them." This suggests either traumatic suppression or the events exist in a cognitive space that language cannot adequately represent. The silence isn't concealment, it's the appropriate response to experiences that exceed verbal description. The survivors aren't refusing to speak. They're demonstrating that some testimonies can only be delivered through silence. The recorded interviews contain extensive periods of unmarked silence, minutes where nothing was said, but testimony was being given through absence of speech. The archive preserved these silences as intentional testimony, labeling them nonverbal documentation of inexpressible experience. Camp Custer Cemetery was established 1917, expanded through 1919 to accommodate training casualties and influenza deaths. Final Cemetery Survey, conducted 1922 before the facility's closure, documented 347 burial plots occupied, maintained, properly marked. A 1968 Cemetery Preservation Survey documented 383 occupied plots. 36 additional graves had appeared in the 46 years since the final official burial. The new plots showed no signs of recent interment. Grass established, ground settled, weathering consistent with 1918 to 1919 burials. The graves hadn't been dug recently. They appeared to have always been present, despite not existing in 1922 documentation. All 36 additional plots contained remains identified through military procedures as Company G personnel who died November 1918. The markers bore names, ranks, dates of death. Standard military grave markers, period-appropriate weathering, official cemetery placement. But no burial records existed for these names. No death certificates, no casualty reports, no evidence of interment ceremonies. Most disturbing, 7 of the 36 names belonged to men documented as surviving the war, returning home, living into the 1950s and 1960s. Private Daniel Foster's grave appeared in the 1968 survey with death date November 10, 1918. Daniel Foster died in Ohio, 1952, of natural causes at age 61. His obituary documented his survival of WWI, his subsequent career, his family. Yet his grave at Camp Custer contained remains certified through standard exhumation protocols as belonging to Private Daniel Foster, showing age-appropriate physical characteristics for a man in his 20s, with injuries consistent with the November 10th training accident. The grave existed despite Foster surviving. Both realities remained documentarily accurate. The cemetery investigation attempted to resolve these contradictions through exhumation and forensic analysis. 7 graves containing names of survivors were opened under court order. Each contained human remains, properly interred, showing decomposition consistent with 1918-1919 burial. DNA analysis, when possible, matched living relatives' profiles. The men were both alive and buried. The graves existed despite the continued existence of those buried. The investigation report concluded, cemetery documentation suggests death and survival aren't mutually exclusive states. Graves appear for personnel who both died and didn't die in November 1918, indicating either parallel outcomes or temporal superposition where both possibilities remain active. The graves aren't false. They're correctly placed documentation of deaths that occurred in one version of November 1918, while other versions continued with survivors. The cemetery remains maintained by the Veterans Administration. The additional graves receive the same care as officially documented burials. The cemetery map shows both the 1922 plots and the subsequent appearances, marked with special notation. Status, retroactively manifested. The final notation in the preservation report: we maintain graves for men who may not have died, or who died but also survived, or who died in one November but lived through another. The cemetery honors all versions simultaneously, unwilling to choose which deaths were real when all deaths appear equally documented. The complete documentation of Camp Custer November 1918 anomalies, investigation reports, testimony transcripts, photographic evidence, medical records, cemetery surveys, was compiled into a classified archive designated Collection 1980 CC Temporal. The archive was sealed 1963, restricted to specialized historical researchers with appropriate clearances. In 1984, archival staff conducting routine preservation maintenance discovered the collection had reduced itself. Documents within the sealed archive had vanished, not removed by personnel, but disappeared from within locked storage. The archive room remained secure. Access logs showed no entries, yet approximately 40% of the documentation no longer existed. The missing materials followed specific patterns. Documents that explicitly described temporal inversions vanished, testimony stating clear conclusions about cause and effect violations disappeared. Photographs showing the most obvious impossibilities were gone. What remained were documents describing the anomalies through implication rather than statement. Records that gestured toward impossibility without declaring it, evidence that accumulated contradiction without resolving into explanation. The archive had curated itself, removing the most direct evidence while preserving ambiguous documentation. Archival staff examined environmental conditions, investigated theft, reviewed security measures. The documents hadn't been removed by human agency. They had ceased existing within the archive's boundaries, as if the collection itself rejected materials that stated the anomalies too explicitly. One archivist's report theorized, archives preserve what can be preserved. Some evidence resists preservation, not because it's physically unstable, but because it's conceptually unstable. Documentation that clearly states time operated non-linearly in November 1918 might be too paradoxical to exist in permanent archives. The collection is maintaining internally consistent documentation by removing documents that explicitly contradict historical continuity. What remained created a curious effect. Researchers examining the archive encountered overwhelming evidence of temporal anomalies, but no document stated this conclusion directly. The evidence accumulated through implication, through contradiction, through gaps in documentation, through what documents couldn't say rather than what they did say. The archive became a collection of silences shaped like proof, absences arranged to imply presence, documentation that testified by vanishing. The current archive status, updated 2003, collection incomplete by design. Materials that stated impossibilities too directly have been naturally archived out of existence. What remains constitutes the maximum documentation possible for events that resist documentation. Researchers must read absences as evidence, interpret missing materials as testimony, understand that the archive's gaps are themselves the most accurate record. The missing 40% of materials is cataloged as self-archived. The catalog entries exist, the materials do not. Both conditions persist as permanent archive status. One catalog entry, dated 1984, notes, "We maintain records of documents that remove themselves from our records. This is appropriate. Some testimonies can only exist as testimony about their own erasure." Camp Custer closed 1919. The facility was dismantled, land returned to civilian use, buildings demolished or relocated. By 1925, no physical trace of the camp remained. The training grounds became agricultural land, then suburban development through the 1950s and 1960s. Modern Battle Creek, Michigan occupies the territory, ordinary and unmarked. But reports continue. Between 1947 and 2018, 73 documented incidents involve individuals reporting temporal disorientation at the former Camp Custer location. Construction workers pausing during foundation excavation, experiencing minutes-long gaps in memory. Residents describing mornings when their homes feel occupied by previous architecture. Walls seeming farther apart, hallways extending beyond floor plans, rooms connecting impossibly. November brings increased frequency. Between November 9th and November 17th each year, local phenomena intensify. Photographs taken at the location sometimes show structures that don't exist. Recordings capture sounds of military formations. Ground-penetrating radar occasionally detects building foundations that vanish when excavated. The phenomena don't match haunting narratives. No apparitions, no traditional ghost experiences. Instead, temporal overlaps, moments when 1918 remains present beneath 2018, instances where the camp's dissolution didn't complete entirely. Historical societies maintain documentation. The reports are filed, investigated when possible, archived in local collections. No official explanation exists. The land continues its ordinary function while occasionally allowing 1918 to surface through the accumulated decades. In 2003, a construction crew excavating for suburban development discovered military equipment buried 3 feet below current ground level. Standard WI-era items, canteens, belt buckles, ammunition casings, except the items showed no corrosion, no deterioration. The metal remained pristine, as if buried yesterday despite being underground since 1918-1919. The equipment was documented, collected, transferred to historical preservation. Some items bore serial numbers traced to Company G inventory. Other items matched descriptions from the undocumented equipment reports, the specialized apparatus that appeared without requisition records. Current ground level has risen approximately 8 inches since 1919 through natural soil deposition. The equipment buried in 1918 should be 40 inches underground. Yet it was discovered at 36 inches depth, as if it had been buried more recently, or as if time compressed the intervening decades into fewer inches of soil accumulation. The archaeological report noted, artifacts exist in temporal superposition. Buried in 1918, discovered in 2003, but showing aging inconsistent with 85-year interment. The objects appear to exist partially in 1918 and partially in 2003 simultaneously, experiencing both periods with equal presence. Local historical marker installed 2011 at the former Camp Custer site reads, Site of Camp Custer, U.S. Army Training Facility, 1917–1919. Several thousand soldiers trained here before deployment to WWI operations. The facility's history includes documented administrative irregularities that remain subject to historical investigation. The marker doesn't specify the irregularities. Visitors photograph it, read the brief text, continue their days. The land appears ordinary, residential streets, modest homes, municipal parks. But November still arrives every year. The dates November 9th through November 17th continue occurring. And in those 8 days, the former Camp Custer site sometimes remembers what happened there, or what's still happening, or what never stopped happening, despite appearing concluded. Archives continue expanding. New documents surface. Letters found in estate sales, photographs discovered in attic storage, diary entries transcribed from aging veterans' effects. The documentation grows rather than resolves. The final investigation, conducted 2015 by military historians accessing newly declassified materials, concluded, Camp Custer November 1918 represents documented temporal anomaly without explanation or resolution. Evidence suggests events occurred non-linearly, possibly continue occurring, and resist final historical closure. Recommend ongoing documentation and acknowledgement that some historical events don't conclude. They persist in permanent present tense, accessible through investigation, but not resolved through analysis. The roll call listing soldiers who were never deployed remains in archives. 23 names marked present for a formation that couldn't have occurred, signed by an officer who was already dead, documenting a mourning that happened in 2 locations simultaneously. The list still exists. The names remain recorded. The contradiction persists. Because some testimonies don't seek resolution. They seek witnesses, people willing to examine impossible documents, consider contradictory evidence, acknowledge that history sometimes refuses linear sequence. The soldiers who were never deployed continue standing in formation somewhere between 1918 and present moment, waiting for someone to recognize they're still there, still present. Still answering roll call across more than a century of accumulated investigation that brings understanding closer without ever reaching conclusion. The documentary evidence sits in archives, waiting. The photographs continue changing, the graves multiply, the silence testifies, and November keeps arriving, 8 days each year, when the echo becomes briefly louder and someone standing on ordinary Michigan ground might feel the past pressing against present. Might glimpse the camp that dissolved but never completely departed, might hear voices answering names across temporal distance, marking time that refuses to stay marked, documenting presence that transcends documentation. The investigation continues. It will always continue. Because the real discovery isn't what happened at Camp Custer November 1918, it's recognizing that it never stopped happening.